Hi, Paul here from Octopus Deploy. On the line, I've got Andrew Stanton Nurse. Andrew works for the NuGet project, and he works for Microsoft. Maybe, Andrew, you can tell us a bit about how that works.
Yeah, I actually work for the Azure Developer Experience team at Microsoft, but I dedicate full time to NuGet. Basically, NuGet itself is an Outer Curve Foundation project. The source code is owned by the Outer Curve Foundation, which is completely independent from Microsoft. But the NuGet core team is basically made up of a whole bunch of Microsoft employees who are paid to work on NuGet. It's kind of, it's easy to see NuGet as a Microsoft product, but I mean, it is really just a community effort that we're trying to drive as much as possible. And we take open source contributions. Pretty much every release in the last little while has had contributions from the community. So
That's awesome. So it's a real open source project, but you happen to be employed by Microsoft, as are a few other people on the team.
yeah,
Great. I saw on Twitter that you guys had started using Octopus Deploy, so we got in touch to say we would love to see what you're doing with Octopus and how you're using it. Obviously, the NuGet website and the services around it have become a huge part of the .NET ecosystem. A lot of people wouldn't be able to compile their code if those services weren't online. So thanks for agreeing to give us a tour of what you're doing.
yeah, no problem. Happy to.
So I can see we've got your dashboard up on the screen, and you've got a few projects and a few different environments.
Yeah, so I can give you sort of a quick overview of what we've got here. So our projects here, we've got the NuGet V2 gallery. This is kind of the main thing. This is NuGet.org, the website itself. And as of about end of last year, that was kind of all NuGet was. It was just really one big gallery. Um, uh, you might have seen there was a blog post on our NuGet blog that we're building this new sort of API v3 infrastructure where we're trying to break a lot of this big service we've got into a lot of smaller pieces. And so we're starting to see a couple of those. You can see a couple of those pieces coming in right now. We've got the NuGet search service, which we released a couple of weeks ago. So that's an independently running machine just dedicated to handling search. And then we've got this NuGet work service, and this is just a back-end service that's doing things like maintaining backups and aggregating statistics for us and things like that. So that's the three services we've got here, and we definitely expect to grow this out as we're basically moving to a sort of a microservice model where we've got a bunch of small services that we deploy independently.
So that brings up an
And that's
interesting challenge, doesn't it? Like when you've got one website, it can be fairly easy to deploy it manually, but when you start getting more and more, that becomes more time spent moving things around, configuring things, and things start to become a bit inconsistent.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's really what started driving us to look at what could we do to automate this more. Because when we were just deploying a single website, it's pretty easy when you're deploying just one website to just say, yeah, and we use Azure Cloud Services, so I'll just take the package and go to the portal and click upload and put it in. It's really that easy. But once it starts to grow from I'm going to just deploy this one website every couple of weeks to I have now 10 different services and I want to deploy one of them every day, that's going to be a big problem. And that's sort of what drove us to looking at Octopus.
Awesome. And you've got a few different environments. So
Yeah,
dev, in production, a bit of a pipeline that you're putting your releases through.
yeah, and it's sort of your standard dev pipeline is auto deployed from our master branch, and then the int pipeline, the int environment is just for our sort of test runs. That's where our QA team does sort of their passes over to make sure we're not regressing things. And we've got a lot of automated tests, but they also do a bunch of manual stuff. And then prod is just the production environment that you see day to day.
Yeah. So the question, well, what tends to happen on a lot of projects is the production environment never mimics the pre-production environments. I'm curious to see your environments tab and get a picture of how many servers you're deploying to.
Well, it's a bit of a it's not going to be as exciting as I think you might think because we're using Azure and we're using Azure Cloud Services. We actually really only have one tentacle machine right now. Um, we have one machine and a bunch of and three instances of tentacles, and all they really do is they sit there being able to sort of push things up to Azure using the deploy to Azure scripts.
Yes.
Yeah. So they're not terribly exciting there. They're just basically agents more than tentacles. They're just doing work rather than receiving the code package and setting it up.
Okay.
Yeah. And so our process, I can actually go into sort of what it looks like to deploy the gallery. I think this is pretty safe stuff to show. Yeah. It really is basically just, we have a configuration repository, and this is one of the challenges we had to deal with a little bit, is we try to do absolutely every piece of code we use as open source. So if you go to GitHub and to the NuGet Gallery project on GitHub, it's literally the same code that we're running in production. There's no private fork. There's no modifications made there. And so obviously we've got all these settings that we want to maintain. So we store those internally, and for various policy reasons, we can't even really put them on Azure right now. We just keep them inside our corporate network. And that's where Octopus's sort of the server and tentacle model really helped us out there, because what we actually do is we have the server is running up here, up in Azure, and you can see that it's got a cloudapp.net domain name, but we actually run a polling tentacle inside our corporate network that has access to those secrets. And so the first thing we do is we basically pull those secrets across, and then we just run through a sort of standard Azure deploy to staging and VIP swap kind of model.
Okay, very nice. So the first step is you're sending an email, presumably to tell people that the site's going offline.
Yeah, and we actually really like that. One of the really nice things about that is we can just say only do that in production, because we don't want to be notified every time some dev pushes something out.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really cool. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And then you pull down your configuration settings from that internal environment. And then you've got an Azure deployment step. So this is, some people using Octopus are probably just using tentacles and pushing NuGet packages and having tentacles configure it. You're using the Azure deployment step, which pushes cloud service packages up to your Azure environments.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so basically we run in web and worker roles in Azure. We're not using the virtual machines right now. We're doing that because we really like the automatic maintenance that's provided there. And so we pretty much all of our services look the same, and they just do this deployment up to Azure. We build cloud packages, the CS package files on our TeamCity build server, and then we just basically pull that and a config file from our internal repository and just push it up to Azure.
Very nice. And then you've got another email step, and then a manual step. So for people who haven't seen this, a manual step will pause the deployment halfway through, and someone can manually come and choose to proceed or potentially abort the deployment if there's been a problem. So what are you using that for?
That's another step that we only use in production, and it's kind of that last, like we kind of liked a little bit the kind of the manual deployment in production, because it gave us a chance to just make sure everything's really good and then hit the button manually. And when we went to Octopus, we didn't want to lose that little manual check at the end. So when you deploy to the production environment, we automatically get it up into the staging slot, and in an Azure Cloud Service, you've got a production slot that's actually listening on your main IP address, and a staging slot you can access with a special URL. And we get all that done automatically, but then we have the ability, and we really like this about Octopus, that we have this ability to sort of send out an email and say, okay, everything is ready, now go take a look, do your final test pass, and then just press the button, and Octopus will take care of the rest. It's really great.
So you don't use that for the pre-production environments, it's just for the production to get that final human check?
Yeah. Yeah, it's just in our production environment.
Okay. And so something that people might not know is that Azure Cloud Services have a staging slot and then a production slot, and you can deploy things to them separately, or a common pattern is you deploy to staging, then you swap into production, which effectively is just pointing the IP address to the new set of machines. And so suddenly your production environment becomes staging. So it looks like there you're deploying to staging, you do the VIP swap, and then you deploy this because the old production release has now become staging. You're deploying to that staging environment now.
Yeah, and we do that sort of second deployment to staging just to make sure that both of our environments have the same code so that we can, if we need to make configuration changes or we have the ability to switch the gallery into a read-only mode, but at the moment that requires restarting the servers, we can do that in the staging slot and then swap it back in again. So we want to make sure both sides of the production staging coin have the same code.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. Some people might not want to do that last step, I suppose. If you might want to keep your old production release running on your staging environment in case there's some kind of problem that is forcing you to roll back quickly. You can always then manually swap things back. But that's very cool. And then lastly, you send another email to say, presumably everything's gone okay.
Yeah, or everything hasn't gone okay, depending on the outcome.
Does that happen very often?
It hasn't happened in production yet.
Oh, that's good. So because we have this ability, you can see like there's a list of steps, but on each of the steps you can choose conditions on when it runs. So if we look at that notify failure step, for example, there'll be a setting that says this only runs if the deployment fails.
Yeah, that's exactly what we do.
Very cool. So if you go back to the dashboard.
Absolutely.
So what's kind of interesting is like Azure has this kind of small lifecycle model of a staging environment and a production, but the staging environment in this case isn't being used for kind of development testing or UAT stuff. It's actually you deploy to it and then almost immediately it's going to get swapped to become production. So then that brings up the challenge of if I've just got one Azure cloud service, how am I going to have my kind of life cycle of development environments, testing environments, that sort of thing. So I guess you've solved that by you've got 3 different Azure cloud services, but you use the same Octopus Deploy deployment process to push the same set of packages to all 3 of them.
Yeah, and that's exactly how we do it. In many ways, the production staging slot feature is sort of designed for mostly for that continuity of service, right? So if I'm updating any cluster of web servers or any cluster of servers, you can sort of do it in a couple of ways. You can either update one at a time and make sure they come back online before you move on to the next one, or you can update a new set of servers and then flip them, right? And so we're sort of using that second model of updating that second set of services and then flipping them in one quick operation that doesn't have any downtime. And so in order to get the development pipeline, we just have 3 different cloud services for each of them. So we basically have, we have 9 cloud services represented here. Each box is a different, something.cloudapp.net URL.
Very cool. And I noticed that in your deployment steps, you're using a lot of variables. Is it possible to see how they're being used?
I think there's nothing terribly scary about those variables. Let me go. So mostly, actually, that's not where I want to be. Mostly our variables are controlling things like the names of the deployment of the cloud service we're deploying to.
So these are the individual cloud service names.
Yeah. So yeah, there's the dev one, the int one, and the prod one, and those are the names, and you can go look at them, but there's nothing terribly exciting about them. They don't have any exciting data on them because they're the dev and int environments. So we use them to control that. We also have, I'm not sure I can go into the library set because our Azure Common variable set just has things like our subscription IDs. And we use the scope to basically, all 3 of these environments represents a different Azure subscription, just for some degree of isolation and billing tracking reasons. So we have a variable set that contains a variable called, in fact, I can take a look at the thing. It's called something like, deployment.subscription ID, which is the ID of the subscription to deploy to. And then in our variable set, we define that variable, and in dev it points to subscription A, and int it points to subscription B, and so on.
Nice. So they're all defined in one place. And I guess for the benefit of people who are using Octopus 1.6 or earlier, previously all your variables had to be defined on a per project basis, and now you can define a set of variables, a library variable set, and scope them to different environments, but then reference them from multiple projects. So this way, you just have that one subscription setting per environment, and you don't have to sort of copy the value around.
Yeah, it's great. And as you know, every one of these can just use that same Azure Common variable set, and it makes it really easy for us to spin up new services and just say, hey, I need these two variable sets. And the other variable set we've got is just the contents of our emails. It's just HTML that we just put in a variable, so we didn't have to keep copy pasting it. So
very cool. And so you'd mentioned that obviously you've only just started using Octopus. What was the deployment process like before Octopus?
it was extremely manual. It was probably as manual as you could get in the Azure world. It was basically so over. I can actually also show you. We've got a Team City instance, and that's what builds our code. And so we have the V2 Gallery project here, and it just as part of the build, we get out a CS package file. And our previous deployment step was to basically just download this file and grab the CS config file, which is the sort of values for a web, it's the CS package and CS config kind of work a bit like a web config in that you can have a bunch of settings defined in your CS package and then the values defined in your CS config. So it's kind of like patching your web config. And so all of our passwords and stuff are in the CS config files that we keep internally. And so the process is you go to Team City, you download the CS package, you go to the file share that has the CS config files, you grab those, and then just literally go to the Azure portal and click the upload button.
Right.
Browse to the packages.
So a lot of manual steps there, and I guess not a lot of transparency too. Like I guess if you're in the middle of a deployment, no one else can really see what's going on, or someone's got to kind of tap you on the shoulder and say, are you deploying today? When did that deployment finish?
Yeah, and we've actually had a couple cases where we weren't entirely on the same ball of where deployments were going, and most of those only happened in the internal testing environments, but it's still good that we can now sort of come to this dashboard and see, one of them will change, see the live status of each environment and each service. It's great.
So making that switch then from deploying things manually, it gives your team a bit more like insight into what's being deployed and when it's being deployed. Have there been any other positive impacts of it?
Yeah, we've seen basically a dramatic. We've only been using Octopus for maybe 3 or 4 weeks now, 3 I think, and we've already seen a dramatic increase in the rate of our deployments. Because it was such a manual process, what we used to do was we have a 2-week iteration period, and at the end of the iteration, we would do a deployment, and we would kind of just schedule it, and then everybody would get in a conference room on Thursday, and we would say, okay, let's do it, and click the buttons and do the things, and everybody would sit around waiting for things to deploy. With Octopus, we've now done 3 deployments in the past 2 weeks. Because that's still we still feel that's a bit too slow, but we're sort of already speeding up, and we're already saying, well, now I can do a deployment by just clicking a button and feel confident that our automation is going to run, because one of the things we're starting to integrate into this is actually running some of our automated tests as part of the deployment process. As we get more confident with that automation, we're starting to speed up and starting to be able to deploy smaller chunks more frequently. Which is a way more stable way to sort of manage things. There's a lot less testing overhead when you're only deploying a couple new features at a time.
That's fascinating, really great, isn't it? Like automation isn't just about making things faster or saving that bit of time when you're doing deployment. It's very common that once people start to automate, that friction becomes eliminated, and so they start to deploy more often. And then by deploying more often, you're deploying smaller things. Things are less likely to go wrong. And it becomes this virtuous cycle of just, it's easy to deploy, so I deploy more often. Because I deploy more often, it's easier to deploy. And especially when you talk about like agile software delivery, agility is all about being able to deliver things to customers quickly. If you're doing 2-week iterations or 1-week iterations, but you're not actually deploying things, you're not really delivering that value all the way to production.
Yeah, definitely. And we found that Octopus hasn't necessarily sped up the deployment. It has a little bit because there's all those manual steps that we've gotten rid of. But what's most important about what Octopus has gotten us is that it's it's parallelized the deployment. I don't have to sit there and do it, right? I can just start it, and it might take the same amount of time to run, but I can go do other things and come back to it, and I can, it lets someone else do the work. I don't have to sit there and click a bunch of buttons.
Right, and I guess it also lets other people participate in the deployment, maybe if not to production, but to those pre-production environments with the same level of consistency. Whereas when you're kind of relying on people copying files around, doing things in the right order, it becomes harder to trust too many other people on the team to be able to do that in a consistent way.
Yeah, and that's sort of why in the old world we basically used to just schedule our deployments and get in a conference room because we all wanted to make sure that we got it right. And now we've got a lot of that automated and we don't have to worry about it so much.
Cool, that's fantastic. Any other comments or feedback on Octopus? Anything we can improve?
I think Octopus is great. Yeah, we've got some ideas. It'd be cool if we could get some federated authentication in with our own internal sort of authentication stuff. But otherwise, I mean, we've been loving it. We haven't had a chance to dive really, really deep yet, but I think we're going to. I think we're really excited about this, and also really excited to be using something that is really built on NuGet. It's really great. It's kind of this. It's kind of this interesting cycle of like NuGet is using Octopus and Octopus is using NuGet, right? So.
Yeah, I mean, NuGet is a foundation of how Octopus Deploy works, and Octopus Deploy started pretty much as soon as NuGet came out and gave us a great packaging format for applications, and it's quite cool that it's sort of come full circle now.
Yeah, we're loving it. And this Octopus instance that we've got right now, we're actually going to be opening up guest access to it, and so people can even just watch what's going on, and they can see what versions we're about to deploy.
Wow, so by the time this video goes public, people should be able to go to nuget-octopus.cloudapp.net and log in as a guest and be able to see what you're doing.
Yeah, and these versions match up with builds on our publicly accessible Team City site, and then you can use that to track back to the commit, and you can actually see the code that we're just about to deploy. So if you want to get a sneak peek at new features, you don't have to, wait for people to talk about them. You can just take a look at the code.
That's fantastic. Awesome, Andrew. Well, thanks very much for your time today. It's great to see how you're using Octopus.
Yeah, thank you very much.